that is why it is so important that we have as little room for interpretation as possible. What really is needed is here very crystal clear guidelines.
Hello, and welcome back to the Bankers Masterclass series in association with Deutsche Bank, looking at the EU Funds Transfer Regulation 2015 and its impact on financial institutions. I'm Joy McKnight, Deputy Editor of The Banker, and I'm joined by Stefan Fruschki, Head of Regulatory Management, Institutional Cash Management at Deutsche Bank. In Chapter 3 of this four-part series, Stefan provides some insight into the remaining hurdles financial institutions need to overcome between now and the revived FTR's implementation in June 2017. Thanks so much for joining us, Stefan. So can you tell me some of the challenges that are still need to be overcome before the implementation?
There is one problem, that is that the FTR itself is not entirely clear. So there's some requirements where that can actually be interpreted quite differently. So and here I see the biggest challenge, the biggest roadblock, so to say, for individual FIs, but also for other involved stakeholders like regulators, so industry as a whole, basically. So as an example, the FTR requires payment service providers in certain scenarios to detect or whether transactions are linked. However, the FTR itself doesn't provide any guidance on when that would be the case. Or another example, you must, as a payment service provider, report on repeated failures. But again, there is no definition what a repeated failure is, and because of that, there is some questions around that.
Okay, and in terms of implementation, is it going to be quite a big a pain for banks to implement FTR 2015, do you think?
That will very much depend on the service and product offering, on the complexity of a bank. So you shouldn't underestimate it, and you should gain a good understanding of the FTR requirements, then to decide what to do and what is appropriate in terms of what implementation measures are required. So there will be banks that will not be really affected in a broader way, but there are other banks like, for example, Deutsche Bank, given its large GDP business, for example, where it is really a full-fledged large cross-divisional project. And what you must ensure when you have these projects, you must approach them from an end-to-end compliance perspective. So as an example, so when you are a payment service provider of the payer, the first thing you must determine when you initiate a transaction is who's actually the payer. And when I say, and the payee, and when I say who's the payer and the payee, that it must be determined in line with the regulatory definition, of course. And that, of course, seems rather simple. But when you go into in cases where you have high sophisticated structures, potentially involving a lot of stakeholders, a lot of parties, maybe several cash legs, it's not so easy to determine anymore. So what you really must understand is the background of a transaction to understand who's the payer legally and the payee. And that information or that knowledge normally sits in the front end, so with the business, and not somewhere in the back end. And that when you have an implementation project, what you must do is bring all stakeholders to one table. So the business, of course, legal, compliance, and your AFC and IT experts.
So what do you think are the remaining challenges to ensure a smooth transition?
So the remaining challenges is really closing those open issues where we still need regulatory guidance. And the good thing is that the European legislators saw this and tasked the European supervisory authorities with the issuance of regulatory guidelines by 26th of June this year. And what is very important in this context is to understand that the FTR puts in place a very comprehensive framework. However, the effectiveness of that framework depends on all stakeholders involved having the same interpretation. And that is not only the FIs, the PSPs, but also the local regulators. And that is why it is so important that we have as little room for interpretation as possible. What really is needed is here very crystal clear guidelines for the implementation and to really have an effective model in place.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Stefan. In the fourth and final chapter of this masterclass series, we're going to look at the benefits that FTR 2015 will bring to the industry as a whole.